So now we're going to move on to some basic intro questions.
Yeah.
So just your name, your year, and what degree you study.
Yeah. So my name is Ben Hines. I'm currently in my third year and I study a combined Bachelor of Commerce and Bachelor of Laws degree.
Great. And, this is going to be like every first year shoot, but can you give us a fun fact about yourself?
Fun fact about myself. Oh, I'm terrible at these in tutorials and now I'm even worse at them. I guess I could say a fun fact would be that I lived in China for about a month and a half at the end of my first year.
That's really cool. And are you in a political party or a campus faction?
Outside of student politics, I'm involved with the Liberal Party, but for the purposes of student politics and this election, I'm running as an independent.
Okay, cool. And why are you interested for running for board?
I say there's so many reasons. It's probably a bit hard to crystallize, but I think if I was going to have to be a bit more specific, I would say there are probably 3 or 4 reasons, and just for the sake of brevity, I'll say 3. Firstly, I think the answer that most candidates will give you right off the bat is that my entire sort of social uni experience has been the best part of uni for me. Clubs, societies, sharing a drink at Courtyard with a friend, all of that has been by far the most important part of my uni experience. And I think the USU obviously is just so critical to facilitating that it was always going to be something that I was interested in giving back to and ensuring sort of continued on for people into the future. Secondly, I would say that the USU is at a really critical time right now. So noting things like the coronavirus pandemic, I think making sure there's sort of a strong team in place to make sure that the USU can continue to function was going to be important. And I thought I would be quite well placed and well suited to help with that. But I think thirdly and finally, in terms of my campaign, whether or not I was going to be successful in being elected, was that I thought that if I could run a really strong sort of independent campaign and do that really well and hopefully have some success with it, I thought what that could possibly do is show other students who, might not have the backing of, say, a political faction or a large group on campus, that they could actually have like a real good go at it. And if they wanted to make a difference at uni, then it was viable for them as well, even if they hadn't, been pre-selected by a certain group on campus or have that backing. So I thought, yeah, that was my third reason, that I thought, helping people get involved in the future.
Okay, cool. And how would you describe the role of a board director?
I think the role of a board director has so many elements to it. I'd probably say I would describe the role firstly as, making the key decisions as to the USU's functioning, and making sure the USU gets things right for students and making sure that student life is sort of the best it can be in terms of their more specific responsibilities. I would also say an important element of the board, and one that I think this year's board in particular have done a great job at, is sort of communicating that to students and making it sort of accessible for everybody and something that everyone can understand, the role of the USU and university.
Cool. And this is moving to more of our more technical questions. So what are 3 of your favorite policies and why?
So 3 of my favorite policies in terms of what I'm sort of doing, I assume that is kind of what the question is getting at.
Yeah.
I would say my first sort of favorite one kind of is pragmatic as to why it's my favorite. And that's to do with backing coronavirus support and welfare. Because I think, like I kind of mentioned earlier, the coronavirus is going to have such a huge impact on clubs, societies, and students. And I think essentially what it really needs to be doing on the part of the USU is it needs to be looking like helping those students get through that transition. And I think probably my main one there would be things such as taking stances on issues that are going to affect students into the future. So that's things like Proctor U use by the university, because that's firstly important in the short term in terms of it's going to affect students now, but it also could potentially have ramifications into the long run. And I think if the USU, whilst obviously it's not the political body that the SRC is, if it takes strong stances on things like that to help students in the time of Corona and afterwards, that's going to be a great thing there. I think my second sort of favorite policy that I would have would be having some more, in terms of campus culture, having some more communal facilities for people. So I think whilst the USU provides some great facilities already, I think Access members should potentially have the capability to have other more communal facilities. So things like sporting facilities, gym facilities, or arts facilities that they can use both themselves and with other USU members. And I would say my third favorite policy that I have would probably be to do with international students and language mentoring programs. So I know the USU already has initiatives in place for things like sort of conversation classes to help with language, but I think having more of a mentoring relationship set up by the USU could be something that could really help international students sort of settle in and acclimatize. So I think that would probably be my third favorite policy of mine.
Great. And just on the topic of ProctorU, can you just maybe elaborate a little bit more on sort of what you think about that and, why you think that might be an important issue for the USU to address?
Yeah, so I think I'll firstly set out why the second part of that question, why I think it's important for the USU to address, just to sort of clarify some comments I also made to Ani as well. So I think there is a clear distinction between the USU and the SRC in terms of like the activist role. I think the SRC is by and large an activist organization, and the USU is focusing more on service provision. But that said, I do think on certain issues there is a role, if not a responsibility, for the USU to sort of give a voice and take a stance. So whilst that might not look like things like protests, what it can look like are things like the Ramsey said a letter that came out last year. So I think on things like ProctorU, especially when there's sort of a widespread student consensus, the USU can and should take a stance on that issue. So I think the thing with ProctorU is that there clearly has been a widespread, like from what I've seen, like almost universal decision by students that have been involved and had their voices sort of put out there, that ProctorU isn't something they want to use or something that they're comfortable using. Just looking into the things that were problems there were issues with privacy. The fact that like a proctor could access your computer, access the files, see everything in your room and everything you're doing was something that was firstly not okay with students on just like a sort of like a vibe basis. They weren't all right with it. But secondly, probably a bit of a breach of privacy. And then there were also issues to do with things like, if you look at the terms and conditions, if they go bankrupt, they can sort of sell all of your personal data that they've collected and not deleted, they've just continued to store it. And I think that was also something that students weren't comfortable with. And the fact that there was just such sort of an outcry of students against this, and the university continued to sort of go on with it and say, we've addressed these issues when they really hadn't, unfortunately. The USU can take a stance on that, and I think it's well placed to do so. And I think the voice of the USU has the capacity to sort of enact change in line with the SRC, but also in a uniquely sort of its own fashion.
Cool. Cool. And you touched on this a little bit with your first policy, but I guess we'll delve a bit more into it now. But obviously, the USU is currently facing unprecedented financial stress due to the loss of revenue due to COVID-19. So, if you had to, what would you cut from the USU's current operations, and how do you think that the USU should economize?
So I think firstly, the way to go in terms of cutting is not necessarily to cut like, I know that like the question that Ani asked was 1 million from any area. And I think that's probably not the right way to go about it, just from my experience in sort of the financial world. Generally, the best way, if you have to cut, is to cut across the board in different areas at different proportions, but also look to sort of economize in terms of how operations are run. And I think that's sort of the first area that you would kind of look to, is looking where things could be done more efficiently, how money that's currently being spent could be spent better or potentially not spent at all. In terms of if I had to sort of reduce spending in one area, I would probably say the area I would do that, if it wasn't possible in the short run, to sort of just not spend on things that you weren't using anyway. So I know quickly, for example, a large proportion of the costs the USU faces are cost of goods sold. So that's the cost of things that you then sell. So it kind of like counteracts each other. The fact that the USU isn't going to be selling so many things means that cost is automatically reduced. But I think if you had to cut something that was probably an ongoing concern, you'd look to things like marketing and things like sales, because ultimately, whilst getting like messages out there is important, it's probably less important right now than other things. But also I think it's a unique area that I think especially board directors could probably get involved with. So I think if you cut the marketing budget, but say had board directors making more public posts or spreading the message themselves, they have the capacity to reach the university community and even other communities in much the same way. So I think that would probably be where I would cut the money from.
Okay, and how do you sort of think that the board directors would play that role as more of a marketing function for the USU? Can you just elaborate a little bit on that?
Yeah, so I think that would probably be twofold in terms of internal and external. So in terms of internal marketing, I think this year's board directors in particular, and some from the year before, have been doing a great job of keeping students involved on their old campaign pages. So when they ran for board, they set up a Facebook page and they've kept updating students on that platform. And I think that's a great way of keeping people involved. But I think the problem there is that what it's done is it's only kept sort of the people who had initially followed their page, or like the small number who would come on afterwards, informed. So I think that firstly. Secondly, taking more control of like maybe their personal pages, or even inviting more people to their old pages, or changing the focus so it doesn't look as much as a campaign page, would help get people involved. and reaching out to other people to help them do that. So they might obviously not have reach with every student, but they can reach out to certain groups of people, societies even, and get that reach more so there. Secondly, using the USU pages themselves and social media, and even university emails. I think that's a great way to get like spreading messages out there. And then, so that's probably internal, and I think that would be quite comprehensive. In terms of external, I think it would probably function in much the same way that many clubs and societies do. So many clubs and societies obviously have sponsorship directors, they have external relations vice presidents, for example. And I think having people on the board forming those relationships, forming maybe corporate relationships with groups or sponsor groups, or just people who the USU would probably be messaging to anyway. I think that would look pretty much the same way it might look like for other societies, just on like a much larger scale.
Okay, cool. And what's one thing that you think the USU has done well during your time at uni?
So I think there are quite a few things. I would say the USU itself during my time, I would say probably recently, just in terms of things that I would emphasize, the way in which this year's board has got more engaged with the student community. I think under Connor Werett's presidency, that's been quite a big focus, is getting sort of board directors more visible, getting the USU itself more visible, and sort of making it so that every student feels like they can engage with the USU and understand a bit more what the USU does. So I think that's obviously going to be critical in so many areas, in like increasing engagement, increasing engagement in things like the elections, and increasing people's willingness to have a go in those elections, increasing clubs and society investment within the program itself. I think all of those things are like directly linked to engagement with the USU and understanding of the USU. So I think, yeah, the main thing I would say has been great during my time, especially this year, has been that increased engagement with the student population.
And I guess we're going to flip that on its head now. And what's one thing that you think that the USU has done poorly during your time at uni?
So I think the one, in terms of my entire time here, and maybe even a slightly ongoing concern, would be the level of consultation, maybe in terms of making certain decisions. So not necessarily decisions that are in camera, because I'd probably say that for a lot of things, that's probably in the best interest of the USU. But it looked like things like when the recent, at the start of last year, clubs and societies funding reforms came out. Apparently, from what I've heard and from my time on exec and talking to other people on those execs, there was incredibly minimal communication and consultation on those changes. So I think that was obviously a huge problem there, because if those changes were going to affect people in the long term and in the short term in terms of their plans, that needed to happen. I think that was improved slightly with the subsequent reforms that came out, but I still think addressing a wider range of people and consulting more people and providing more clear avenues for that consultation to happen, not just on like certain key issues like clubs and societies funding, but on a lot more things, and maybe providing more outlets for people to sort of voice their own concerns. Because whilst people can like come to USU board meetings, firstly, that's like really daunting for a lot of people. And secondly, it might just be inconvenient for them. So I think maybe having greater outlets and greater consultation would always be a good thing.
Yeah, I think that's something that Pulp is trying to do. Like, we're trying to go to board meetings so people can get a bit more information about that. And I guess something I'm also interested on that point is that are you sort of comfortable at the moment with how much the USU goes in camera?
So I think obviously in order to understand that a little bit better, I would have to have been in those sessions that were in camera just to kind of find out exactly what was being discussed. On principle, I'm definitely not against in-camera content, because obviously there are certain sensitive decisions that the USU needs to keep between its board directors in order to keep that from the public, just like any sort of corporation has to do. I think a priority of mine would be making sure that was not happening unnecessarily. So I think if I were lucky enough to be elected, I would probably make sure that things that could not be in camera wouldn't be in camera. But then again, I'm still am in favor of certain things and certain sensitive policies being discussed in camera.
Okay, cool. And you touched on this a little bit earlier, but just to sort of re-emphasize and discuss it a little bit more, how political do you think that the USU should be? Do you think that it should make statements on current political issues affecting student lives? And do you think that it should provide a platform for students' political beliefs?
I don't think it should be political in some senses, but I do in others. So I think it depends ultimately what you mean by political. For a few examples, I don't think it should be sort of a voice springboard for people to voice their own sort of political opinions on certain issues. I probably would argue that for many sort of political issues that would be considered traditionally political in terms of like your federal and state politics, it's probably not the place of the USU to make outlandish comments or take certain stances. So I think in that sense, it probably shouldn't be a political body. That said, I think certain issues that some people and maybe some candidates might consider to be political probably aren't necessarily political in that sense. and are things that affect students so directly that the USU kind of, I would say, has a responsibility to comment. So, for example, I would touch upon things like the Ramsey Center. Whilst there was sometimes imported like a political element to that issue, I think by and large, the USU had sort of an area to talk about in the fact that like that might have affected like the autonomy of the university. And I think that's an issue that probably shouldn't be politicized too much. I think from any sort of political position, like the university lacking autonomy in its curriculum was a bad thing. And I think the USU can and should make comments like that. And yeah, and things like ProctorU, for example, not really a political issue, but you might be considered to be making the USU somewhat more of a political body in taking those stances. I don't necessarily think that's a bad thing because it does affect students, and the USU should be for students and acting in the interest of students and their sort of university experience. So again, I think in issues like that affect student life, it can have a political element, but I don't think it should be a political body in terms of what you would probably traditionally consider to be political issues.
And to discuss sort of a recent example, in one of the recent board meetings, Pulp asked whether the USU should support the SRC's campaign regarding the COVID-19 student rent crisis. And he said that was more strictly to do with the SRC and was not as much for the USU to comment on. What's your sort of perspective on that?
So I think that's a good example of an issue that kind of comes between the two. I think you could probably agree. So it's not necessarily political as would be traditionally conceived, but it does in some ways affect students. And I think what would have to be looked at in that sense is how the USU's sort of policy platform or its platform and its sort of resources would affect that, and whether or not the positions taken or potential positions taken were reflective of the entire or wider or a vast majority of the students. And I think that's probably a key thing for the USU is when it does take those stances. Whilst the SRC as a purely activist body probably has a mandate to act whether or not it has the absolute majority of students, I think if the USU is going to form a stance, it should be a stance that is almost universal in sort of its application. So I think insofar as I would need to have greater information as to the extent to which either like side of that debate was sort of furthered by students and like the level of that, I would need that information to comment more sort of like in depth on that.
Okay, cool. Sort of, taking a different turn now. One controversial decision that the USU made was to allow the registration of Life Choice, an anti-abortion group, as a club. Many people oppose this on the basis of its potential impact on students who have had an abortion. What is your position on how the USU should approach controversial clubs and societies such as these?
Yeah, so I think that's a complex issue, but one that I think should be taken sort of pragmatically in the way it's dealt with. So I think firstly, the USU should be hesitant. So starting from a position of being hesitant to not allow a club or society to sign up. That said, I think there are certain circumstances where it may be valid. I think obviously things like freedom of speech, freedom of association, they're all going to be incredibly important, and not necessarily like clamping down on people's political views is going to be important. That said, I think it needs to then be considered how that club and society is going to act and why it's been formed. So for example, if a club and society had been formed with like the sole intention of harming students or making students feel unsafe, then that's one that I would be happy if that could be like substantially proven and demonstrated to not necessarily allow to sign up, because I think that's incredibly damaging for students. Secondly, I think it needs to be looked at how that club and society was going to be acting. So I think there should definitely be restrictions on like the harassment that clubs could be having. So I think that's an example of where there might potentially have been sort of engagement with students and telling certain students their decisions may have like, been immoral or been bad or something. And I think making sure that that doesn't happen is probably something that's important. And I think, again, whilst it's important not to clamp down on people's sort of right to express themselves or right to have a club or society in favor of a certain issue, that sort of, it's the pragmatic concerns as to how that was going to operate that I think was going to take precedence. So I think, yeah, I would take that not necessarily at a face level value or on the nature of the club in the example of Life Choices, but I would look at how they've historically acted and how they plan to act in the future. And hopefully if the USU lean towards allowing that to happen, maybe get some commitments from members of that society that they would act in like a respectful way to other students.
Okay. And board directors have a fiduciary duty to the USU, which means that you have to put the board's interest above your own and can be sued for acting against its interests. So if something egregiously bad was happening in the USU, would you consider leaking it? And if not, how would you resolve this issue?
So I guess this is kind of getting at the vice president situation from a few years ago. I think by and large, a lot of the decisions that are in the interests of the USU are going to be in the interests of students. I think that's an argument that could generally be made both in terms of like the board itself and pretty legally in terms of like the pragmatics of it. I think, yeah, so there'd probably have to be a situation that demonstrated a clear, irrefutable distinction between the two. So something that was going to be incredibly harmful for students that the USU is doing. In terms of whether or not I would leak it, I think I would err on the side of trying to solve those issues internally. And I think that's probably something that could be done. So I think looking at the people who are on the board right now and looking at the people who are running this year, I've spoken to most of the candidates so far and hope to speak to the rest of them soon. I don't necessarily see a situation where something like that would happen. I think they're all quite reasonable people, and I think they would all have similar ideas as to what would probably be in the interests of the students. So I would hope and probably assume that it wouldn't get to the point where it would have to sort of be an issue of whether or not it needed to be leaked. But yeah, I think upholding that fiduciary duty on like a principled level as well as a practical level is always something that's probably going to benefit students, just because I think it is so intrinsically linked that the USU's best interests are the students' best interests anyway.
Okay. And this links to one of your policies, actually. Do you think that the USU is doing enough to support the international student community? If yes, which programs or initiatives have you found to be particularly successful? And if not, how could the USU better support the international student community?
Yeah, so I think obviously backing the international student community is incredibly important for a USU that hopes to be inclusive and diverse and sort of involve all people. I think the USU is currently doing a good job, but that's not to say it can't improve. So I think the things that are looking good already are things like the International Student Lounge. I think providing that area for international students to feel comfortable is a great initiative, and I think it's really good for people and for international students. I also think things like I said before, the sort of language programs that are in place are incredibly good and incredibly effective. But yeah, like I was saying before, I think there is room for improvement. So that's kind of the theme I would take on that. I think perhaps instituting, like I said in my policy statement, more direct language mentoring programs could sort of take that language system to the next level. I also think that things like having a greater variety of international cuisine and maybe some international student input on that could be something that could be incredibly beneficial. I also think finally, like I said, in terms of taking stances on things, I think the international student concession card thing was something that was important as well. And I know past board directors have talked about that. It was also an issue in the recent SRC elections last year as well. So obviously it's not something that has sort of been finalized. And I think continuing that support for international students, both practically with initiatives, like I said, language mentoring and otherwise, but also symbolically and sort of in terms of wider issues is a good thing that the USU can continue to do and improve on.
Great. And if you are elected as a board member, how will you ensure that feedback is taken into consideration when making board decisions?
So I think obviously the first way that you do that is by making sure the feedback and the sort of consultation is heard by the board members. So I think that looks like keeping account of the mechanisms by which you're receiving that feedback and then what that feedback looks like and conveying that within board meetings and sort of demonstrating what that looks like. And I think that's the first way in which you ensure that. And then obviously making sure that it has a fair discussion. So whilst it might not be possible to have sort of every single piece of input heard, the ones that seem to be most popular or most prevalent, or the ones that seem to be the most important or timely, making sure they get a fair discussion within the board directors and making sure there's like obviously proof of that in the minutes. And then obviously taking that further is getting back to the people who have given you feedback. So a lot of the time, and I think with a lot of feedback mechanisms, the problem is if it's something like a Google form where they just fill it out, you know, anonymously, and this is what I want from the USU, this is what I want from whoever, they don't really hear back unless like they see on Facebook that their policy has been implemented or something. And I think having a mechanism that allows feedback to then be given, be discussed, and then the person who gave that feedback to actually hear about the results, or maybe hear, you know, we unfortunately haven't had enough like reports of this. Maybe if it becomes more prevalent, we'll get back to you. Just even if it's a positive or a negative piece of feedback, making sure they kind of know what's happened to hold the board a bit more accountable, I think would be a good way of doing that.
Okay, cool, good answer. And given that the USU has expressed that they want to be involved in choosing Michael Spencer's replacement, what sort of qualities would you seek in the next Vice Chancellor?
Well, that's an interesting question. I think first and foremost would be a vice chancellor that listens to the concerns of students and appreciates the role that student bodies play. So I think obviously insofar as a vice chancellor arguably runs a university that is functioning for the people who pay for that university and go to that university, he's probably somewhat beholden to making sure that he listens to those people who pay, like who give money to that sort of thing. And I think that looks like somebody who appreciates the role of the USU, the role of Supra, the role of the SRC, etc., and actually listens to the people who give information from that. So hosts regular correspondence with them, implements the sort of things that they suggest, or at least demonstrates why that probably wasn't the best thing. And I'd say has not necessarily a good relationship being necessary, because I think at some points there might be a responsibility of a vice chancellor to disagree with those bodies on some issues. And I think they're probably well placed on some issues to make that decision. But I think at least having an open working relationship and a willingness to have that is a good thing, and probably the quality that I would look for as my foremost quality. Obviously being qualified and having experience being other ones, but just in terms of more specific things that would separate somebody.
Okay, great. And, you know, at the beginning of the year, we obviously saw the closure of Manning Bar, and even during non-corona related times, more and more students aren't, you know, actually coming into campus. So as, you know, a potential board director, how would you sort of move to reinvigorate campus culture?
So I think reinvigorating campus culture looks like not shoehorning past campus culture into the present. So I think one of the issues that kind of hurt Manning in particular was that a lot more people sort of appreciated the vibe of Courtyard rather than going to Manning to drink in the day or something with their friends. And a lot of like the nostalgic posting about Manning Bar was, you know, reminiscing about having a midday beer with your friends at Manning. But I think it's probably a little bit wrong, I'd just say wrong to assume that that can continue in the same way if that's not what sort of students are interested in anymore. I think if you want to invigorate certain premises on campus, you look at what students want and you look at what students are demanding. And I think that again looks like looking to the practices that students are currently having and why they take those decisions. So people like Courtyard, for example, speaking from personal experience and from what I've heard from friends, because, you know, it's open, it's modern, it's like artsy, relaxing, and it's a good vibe, quite literally. And people might rather prefer that, having, say, a beer at Courtyard in the day or a glass of wine at the end of the day, rather than going to like a darker sort of Manning Bar or like a Manning Terrace area. And I think then you kind of have to look at why that's the case and apply that to things like Manning and things like Herman's. If like the board or the wider student community sort of wanted more places open, like wanted Manning to come back open, it would have to be like asking them what they wanted it to look like that would sort of incentivize them to go and use it. Because I found a lot of the people who were currently at university sort of lamenting the closure of Manning, whilst it is a bad thing, obviously Manning's history is incredibly important and it's a nice location. They're the same people who haven't been going to Manning and haven't been using Manning because they've been at Courtyard, right? And I think it looks like making sure those outlets are places that people want to go to, rather than places that we're kind of forcing people to go to through certain mechanisms, because otherwise you're not really going to get them to be viable.
Okay, cool. And now we're just going to move into a couple more administrative questions, and then if we have any follow-ups, we'll just ask those. But do you have any sort of candidates that you really want to work with, or candidates you don't really want to work with at the moment?
So I'm definitely happy to work with any candidate, both before the election, during the election, and if we were lucky enough to be elected. I think what's great about the USU board and the nature of its decisions is you can take a wide variety of different viewpoints, different perspectives, and have them come together and come to a real good decision based on some real good discussion. And from what I've heard from everybody that I've spoken to as well, they're all really nice people, all have some great ideas, and all in it for the right reasons, which I think is incredibly important. So there's no one that I wouldn't work with or wouldn't want to work with in that sense. In terms of who I would specifically like to work with, I would probably lean towards people who, having had that discussion, kind of have similar ideas about how the board should function and what some like important considerations would be. And looking at that currently, that probably looks like Nick Rigby, just because he's probably one of the candidates I've spoken to most historically, because I've known him for quite a long time. He seems to be in the USU race for amazing reasons with some great policies, and we agree on a lot of issues there. But also I would say Belinda Thomas. So I hadn't met Belinda until the start of this year, but I met her at a few events and we've talked a bit. And she's someone, again, who I get along with really well and think has some really good ideas for the board, and someone I would love to work with.
Okay, great. And do you have any preference deals in the works at the moment?
In terms of preference deals, obviously, like I said, kind of talking to all candidates still, keeping options open and just hoping to see what happens there, but nothing is set yet.
Great. And what colour are you running on?
I'm running on a turquoise color.
Turquoise, okay. And do you have a manager?
I do.
Who's that?
Alex Diarujo.
Okay, cool. That's the sort of conclusion of our formal questions. Bina, do you have any questions at all that you wanted to follow up with?
I'm good on my end.
Okay, cool. I think I asked most of my follow-ups during the interview. So thank you so much for being part of this.